I say you are listening to, you are absolutely listening to the George Espinlove Show, coming to you live from the Funny Farm. Now, with no further ado, here comes Georgie!
You can tell it's Friday night at the Funny Farm. We've done something a little bit different here tonight. This is Crazy Friday Night with Seriousness. Maybe. We don't really know. But we have done something different tonight. We're always doing something different around here. Everybody that is in the Funny Farm radio studio, and everyone that is outside in the parking lot and in the grass and up in the trees and over there in the Camel parking lot, everyone that is on the grounds, including all the staff, which is the inmates, the clients, the head cooks, the servers, everyone. I'm talking about everyone. Everyone that is on the grounds right now is in their bare feet. No shoes, no socks, bare feet. This is Barefoot Friday night at the Funny Farm. Yeah, it is. And I'll tell you something else. Have you ever looked at feet real careful? Like really look at them. They are, really look at them. They are these pads with these extensions on the front of them called toes. And when you have a Barefoot Friday night, a Barefoot Crazy Friday night, you get to see all kinds of feet. Big feet, little feet, fat feet, skinny feet, feet with arches, feet with no arches. You get to see all kinds of feet. And so everybody around here is in their bare feet. So this is Barefoot Crazy Friday night with Seriousness, maybe. But in the meantime, if you're a first-time listener, I've already blown you away. You are listening to the George Espinlove Show, coming to you live from the Funny Farm in a place called Our World. And we don't really know where that is. We just live here. We don't have no mailing address. We don't even have a mailbox. But you can email us, georgece@comcast.net. That's georgece@comcast.net. And we will answer every single email that we receive. Thank you for those that have been sending their emails in and telling us where they're from and asking us questions and so on and so forth. So you do the same, georgece@comcast.net. The show last night was, somewhat different. And our shows don't always go the way that we prep for. We'll lean in that direction, but sometimes when we're leaning in that direction, we kind of, like a pendulum, we start coming back, and drifting to the other side. Well, that was something like last night, but it was fun. It was informative, and perhaps it made you think. We were supposed to have with us tonight, excuse me, a lady by the name of Ann P. Rich. That's Ann, with an E, A-N-N-E. Initial P, her last name is Rich. She has written a book entitled 333rd Life on Planet Earth. Now, I have no idea what that consists of, but I'm not going to find out tonight. She will be with us Monday night. She will be in the chair with us, and she will be telling us all about this book and several others that she has written, but this one is 333rd Life on Planet Earth. That ought to be quite interesting. We bring guests in from all walks of life, with all viewpoints, with different viewpoints and many different opinions. But we're bringing them in so we can get people to think, we can get them to listen, and then you decide what you want to do with the information that you received here on the George Espinlove Show. Our goal is to make you smile, even if it's just for a short period of time. Our other goal is to make you as crazy as the rest of us here at the Funny Farm. And we can start off Friday night like this.
There's a leprechaun on my head. I wish that I were dead, for I don't think I'll ever let me be. He tempts me with his gold, and if I were e'er so bold, I'd strangle him and leave him in the street. And then he says to me, you're no Irish laddie, you call that thing a harp. But each time I share the lore that I am learning, he hides his head while my friends they chant. La-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. Oh, la-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da-diddly-diddly-die. There's a leprechaun in my room, he swats me with a broom, that's the reason I forget the words of the song. Oh, he shows a four-leaf clover before my song is over, he's buried it in a bowl of Lucky Charms. And then he says to me, you're no Irish laddie, you call that thing a harp. But each time I share the lore that I am learning, he hides his head while my friends they chant. La-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. Oh, la-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. There's a leprechaun on the floor, he says that I'm a bore, his eyes begin to glaze and he starts to yawn. Oh, he lays on down to sleep, I can see when I a peeping, he's watching me with envy inside. And then he says to me, you're no Irish laddie, you call that thing a harp. But each time I share the lore that I am learning, he hides his head while my friends they chant. La-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. Oh, la-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. There's a leprechaun on the hill, and I know his gold is there, so I grab him by the neck, but he gets away. Well, the pot's too heavy, he giggles, so pinch me just a little, and he thinks I'm full as I run away. And then he says to me, you're no Irish laddie, and you call that thing a harp. But each time I share the lore that I am learning, he hides his head while my friends they chant. La-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. Oh, la-ta-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-ta-tee-da-tee-da, la-ta-tee-da diddly-diddly-die. And then he says to me, you're no Irish laddie, you call that thing a harp. But each time I share the lore that I am learning, he lifts his head and he sings along. La-da-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-da-tee-da-tee-da, la-da-tee-da diddly-diddly-da. Oh, la-da-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-da-tee-da-tee-da, la-da-tee-da diddly-diddly-da. Oh, la-da-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-da-tee-da-tee-da, la-da-tee-da diddly-diddly-da.
Diddly-diddly-die.
La-da-tee-da diddly-dee-da, la-da-tee-da-tee-da, la-da-tee-da diddly-diddly-die.
Diddly-diddly-die, dum-dum. What do you think? Hey, if you want to see something that is... Thank you. Thank you. If you want to see something that is funny, you should see, because, you know, this radio, the Funny Farm radio studio is packed out. And it's packed out outside. Packed out outside. Packed up outside. Packed in outside. No, we're packed in here, but they're packed. What are they packed outside? No, they're not packing their lunch. If we're packed inside. No, if we're packed inside, and there's a whole bunch of them outside, what are they? Yeah, I know that, Smarty. Yeah. Charlie said a whole bunch of people. Yeah. Goof. Anyhow, if you want to see something funny, you don't have your magic mirrors. But anyways, if you want to see something funny, you should see all these loons here at the Funny Farm that has come from our world and the real world, your world out there. If you want to see something really funny, you should see them, because this is Barefoot Crazy Friday Night with Seriousness, maybe. And everybody was out there doing the Irish jig, or what they thought was the Irish jig, in their bare feet. Some of them's got their pant legs rolled up, you know, up like high water pants. And if you want to see something hilarious, why am I saying all this anyhow? All I meant to say was only on the George Espinlaub show will you hear something like that. And I want to dedicate it to all my friends, Harry, Jonathan, and to all my friends over there in Ireland. So when you listen to it, if you're listening to it now, jump in the chat room and tell me. Or if you listen to it later, because we are 5 hours behind you, so it is 11:45. If you listen to it later, I want you to know I have dedicated it to you. And I think that was a pretty cool song. I think.
You said, honey, please think before you ask.
That is toe tapping, finger snapping, head bobbing, shaking your booty kind of music. And yes, they are dancing here at the Funny Farm, inside and out, where there's a whole bunch of people. Whatever it's called, there's a whole bunch of people. Hey, we got some great shows lined up. I mean, we have some interesting things that's coming down the pike. And I think we've got a lot of those kind of shows I call sitting on the edge of your chair stuff. You know what I mean? Like the more exciting it becomes, the more intense it becomes. You scrooch out, and you keep scrooching out, and you scrooch out, and pretty soon you're sitting like only half your booty is sitting on the chair. The other half is kind of hanging out over the side or the front. Excuse me, whichever way you're sitting. But it's some of those. It's not funny. I'm trying to make a point. It's some of those intense. I mean, and I'm being serious. Very intense. Like things that are for real that have taken place in people's lives, and that's about all I can say. But it'll put you out on the edge of your chair, and we're going to do some of that stuff. And we've got it coming, and it's right around the corner. We want you to email us at georgece@comcast.net, georgece@comcast.net. If you have just tuned in, either by way of your iPhone or your Droid or your tablet, whatever kind it might be, or what else? On your computer, if you plug your iPhone dooflicky into the whatchamacallit of your car radio and you're listening as you're going down the road, we're glad to have you. If you're a first-time listener, we're glad to have you. And for you that are listening all the time, and the audience is growing in leaps and bounds, excuse me, I appreciate it so very, very much. I welcome each and every one of you to the George Espinlaub Show. And I'm being very, very serious. I want to take you somewhere right now, and this is the serious part of the show. We were going to have a lady on by the name of Ann P. Rich, who has written a book. She's written several books, but the latest book is 333rd Life on Planet Earth. But we were informed not long before showtime, long enough that we could make the adjustments. We were informed that she will be with us on Monday night. So I got to thinking, which is pretty dangerous sometimes. Several months back, when the audience wasn't so big, I guess it was back in August, I don't know, but nonetheless, we had a guest on by the name of Mr. Paul Green, excuse me, out of Washington, D.C. Mr. Paul Green wrote a book in 2012. I keep forgetting this is 2013. He wrote the book in 2012, and it's called Forgotten Hostages. It's a real-life account because Mr. Paul Green was in and involved with that real-life account. March 9th, 1977, Washington, D.C. experienced its first terrorist attack ever, when a group of extreme Muslims took over 3 buildings in the city of Washington, D.C. A young newsman was killed. Many others were wounded, either by guns or knives or whatever. There was well over 100 100 hostages, over 100 hostages, that was held. Mr. Paul Green was one of those hostages. I want you to listen to this, because this is for real. This happened in 1977, and it's continuing to happen today, unfortunately. Just recently, in the last couple of days in Algeria, some Americans, along with other groups of people, have been kidnapped, held hostage by Al-Qaeda. So it's still continuing to this very day. Go with me as Mr. Paul Green tells us about the forgotten hostages. And I think you will really enjoy. Paul, are you there?
I am, George.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me on your show tonight.
Oh, it's our privilege. Our privilege. I've been waiting for this one. I told the folks on Tuesday night, I think it was Tuesday night, earlier in the week anyhow, we had Mr. Bill Dean with us, who is a investigative journalist, and he wrote a book that based on a true story.
Right.
And we were on the edge of our seats as he took us through his accounts. I told the audience that this is another sit on the edge of your seat nights. So just sit there. You might as well scrooge out on the end of the seat right now because, excuse me, because that's where you're going to be by the time this thing is all over.
Yeah, many people don't know the story, George, and I'm happy to relay it.
Yeah, we were talking, ladies and gentlemen, before we went on the air, and I must say that I had forgotten all about that incident that took place until I received an email from Mr. Green, and then all of a sudden it just came rushing back to me, and I thought, how in the world could I leave something like that slip into the recesses of my mind? It's a startling story, and Mr. Green was there himself. So, Paul, give us a little background about yourself and so on and so forth. And
sure. I'd be happy to, George. I have been a trade association executive up until last year full time for 40 years. Representing a variety of industries. I had a 20-year relationship with the scrap recycling industry. I helped rebuild 2 trade associations, one in the IT industry, one in the telecom. And for the last 10 years, I've been the senior vice president of the Mortgage Bankers Association. That was a lot of fun the last few years, too, as you can imagine, what was going on with the housing industry. But prior to that, I started my career in Jewish communal work right out of college, and this was before I went back to get my master's degree from George Washington University. I actually grew up in Miami, Florida, went to the University of Miami for undergraduate school, and one of my assignments in the Jewish communal world was I was a young executive with B'nai B'rith International from 1974 through 1978, and in 1977 is when this event occurred when I was a young executive with B'nai B'rith International.
You know, I was reading this morning when President Ford spoke there. Excuse me, when President Ford spoke there, and I was reading where they said that he had practiced, or they had practiced with him saying the words.
Yeah, it was humorous. I have to admit it was a wonderful experience being at B'nai B'rith, George. I had an ability to interact with U.S. leaders and actually world leaders. It's just the nature of the organization. And when we met the president, it was the first time I'd seen a U.S. president in person. And we were at the Washington Hilton Hotel for our convention. And that's actually the same hotel where Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, was shot. The Hinckley assassination attempt happened right outside that hotel. But they have this special elevator, and the president steps off, and there's 40 people with him. And, you just don't think about who travels even across town with the president, and there was his doctor and the person with the nuclear codes and all that stuff. And we were standing there, and he he mispronounced B'nai B'rith. He called it B'nai B'rith. And I was in an area where all his speechwriters were following his speech, and there were these huge groans that took place. And I looked down, and one of them said to me, "We practiced that for 2 hours with them. They still missed it." So it was pretty funny when it happened, when President Ford mispronounced B'nai B'rith and said B'nai B'rith.
That's pretty cool because it shows that at least he was human, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was like one of us ordinary fellows, you know. I got a kick out of that when I was reading that, and I was thinking that
it was real.
That's really great. Paul, take us back to March 9th, 1977.
Yeah, you know, George. It started. I actually, it was interesting. I thought about this. I'd been out with the flu for a number of days, and it was really like one of my first days back after being under the weather. And I just went into the office as any normal day, as any person in America went about their business and said goodbye to their family. And my wife Jane and I, we had one daughter at the time, Emily, now who's 38. She probably doesn't want me to give her age, but she's 38. And, it was just two at the time, and said goodbye to them that morning. And went in, and about 11 o'clock that morning, George, I started hearing noises. And I heard glass breaking and other things happening. And my office was on the 5th floor. If the listeners would picture a building 8 stories high, we had 2 elevators in the building and also 2 sets of stairwells. And B'nai B'rith, actually the year and a half prior, had decided to build a mirror image of this 8-story building. So now there were 2 aspects of the building, but they didn't add any additional elevators, and certainly now there was a new stairwell. And I heard this noise, George, and I walked down into it from the 5th floor area. I had said to my assistant, Harriet Berman, at the time, I don't know what that is, but I'll go down and take a look. And walked down and then ran into some colleagues around the 3rd floor. And actually a young woman from accounting department came out and said there was a gunman in the building, she heard. But it still didn't bother me. And when I walked over to the stairwell landing and actually went down a little bit, I saw two men throwing construction equipment down the stairs. They were throwing ladders and paint cans, and one was instructing the other, you pick this up and throw that down. And a number of colleagues looked down at me and said, "What's that?" And George, the first thing that came to my mind was it was 2 construction workers who had been fired, came back for retribution against the building.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Right? What else could I think about? And I didn't see any weapons at the time. I just saw them throwing the stuff down the stairwell. And I walked back up, and then there were a number of us who were now standing around the 3rd floor elevator bank, and I heard another noise, George, the other stairwell in front of me. And I walked to that stairwell, and coming up the stairs 2 at a time was a man, and he saw me, and I saw him, but he had 2 pistols with him. He had a 45 Colt pistol and also a 357 Magnum. And he's screamed some profanities at me and told me to freeze, but I actually backed away from the door, and he came through the door and with a big smile on his face, and now there were probably maybe 10 or 15 of us standing around this elevator bank, and he had a big smile on his face, and he said to us, "All you people hit the floor, you're dead." And that was my introduction to Abdul Latif, who was the second in command. I didn't know it at the time, but this was the second in command of the Hanafi Muslims who had come into the building. Unbeknownst to me, and I could take instructions very well. I mean, I hit the floor along with all my colleagues, and I actually thought it was a robbery. I really did, George. I still, my brain wasn't working in any other fashion, but this is probably a robbery. And I did not know at that time, but certainly we learned as the event unfolded, that Hanafi Muslim terrorists, 7 of them, who came to our building, had pulled up in front of the B'nai B'rith building with a U-Haul truck that contained enough food for themselves for about 7 to 10 days, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and an assortment of 37 weapons.
Mm. So they were planning on staying for a while.
They were, George, and so here we were now, and this is a little after 11 o'clock the morning of March 9th, 1977, that we are now lying on the ground in front of this elevator bank, and the first words we heard are that if we didn't hit the ground, that all of us were going to be killed.
Now, who are these, or who were these Hanafi Muslims?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. The Hanafi Muslim sect was formed in America by a gentleman by the name of Hamas Abdul Khalis. His English given name was Ernest X McGee, who grew up in the Midwest and then had gone to New York. He had served in the Army, had been discharged, and they had said it was some kind of mental issue, but I could tell you he wasn't mentally ill, George, certainly the time that I was with him for the 40 hours of our event. But he actually rose up in the ranks of the Nation of Islam, and he was the third person in command behind Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam movement. Mm. So he was very well known in that Islamic movement of the Nation of Islam. And he, though, had a falling out with Elijah Muhammad and the leadership. He actually didn't like the way the movement was going, and it was objecting to the things that they were doing, and had a much more purist thought about Islam. And he sent out a letter, and he broke away from the Nation of Islam to form the Hanafi movement, and then he sent out a letter to the entire Nation of Islam movement denouncing Elijah Muhammad and the leadership movement. And this was in the early 70s. Mm-hmm. And then in 1974, the Nation of Islam movement, there was a number of chapters around the country, and one of them was in Philadelphia, and one of their temples, and individuals, I think there were about 7 or 9 of them, came down to kill Hamas Abdul Khalis at the Hanafi Center, which they had a house on the 16th Street heading in towards Washington from the Silver Spring area. Beautiful home. And there's a story to the home also, George, is that when Hamas Abdul Khalis was in New York, he developed a friendship with this young man and mentored him in the Islamic faith and actually gave him his Islamic name. And we knew him when he was a teenager as Lou Alcindor, and then he became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a follower of Hamas Abdul Khalis and actually bought them the Hanafi Center house and funded that. Mm. So, as this thing unfolded, there were incredible ironies that were happening that involved many people. So they came down, this hit squad came down into Philadelphia to kill Hamas Abdul Khalis. And he was not in his house when they came down. They broke into the house, and they brutally murdered numerous members of his family. They actually drowned a number of the grandchildren in the bath, in a wash basin in the basement, in a bathtub, killed a son and a daughter, and brutally wounded a daughter-in-law. So it was a horrific slaying that took place in that particular house. And there were circumstances that, whether it happened then, but I think it was happening before, where Khalis was incredibly anti-Semitic. He was virulently anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. And there was a number of circumstances where there were 2 synagogues near the Hanafi Center. He felt perhaps the Jewish community didn't support him during this time of need. There was also a Jewish judge that handled the case of the killers. They did catch all of them. They were tried in D.C. court and all sentenced to life in prison, long prison sentences. And Khalis felt that they weren't given the death sentences or carried out death sentences that were needed for the horrific slaying of his family. So these are the things percolating up, but this is who these people were as they came through the B'nai building. And the interesting thing, it happened a little bit later. What happened in the initial stages is, I didn't know at the time, is they were taking over the building, George, through the stairwells. And they knew the building well because while the building was being constructed, a number of the terrorists served as construction workers. They came in and, they picked up trash and did other odd jobs and things. So they actually had been in the building before and had staked it out and knew the building very well. Mm. And what they did also is they cut off the elevators on the second floor, and now we're taking the building up through the stairwells.
Wow. And this it's like a whirlwind. This is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly intense. While we were lying on the floor, I heard gunshots for the first time, and I was starting to think, well, this maybe is more serious than some kind of robbery. And then we were instructed to stand up, and it was interesting how we fell. We all stood up. It was almost like a conga line had already formed. I did know how many people were behind me. There were 2 people in front of me. The man, and by this time also, George, Latif, the second in command, was still standing. He was standing off to our left, and now I saw another terrorist show up, and he now was standing in the stairwell door, and he had a semi-automatic carbine rifle, and his name was Abdul Adam. And I looked at the man at the front of the line, and I knew him well, a colleague actually who had interviewed me when I first came to B'nai B'rith. His name was Norman Buckner, and he was in charge of our international division at B'nai B'rith. And George, I looked at the man in front of me, and I was sort of dumbstruck. I didn't know who it was. There was someone standing in front of me in line that I didn't recognize. Wasn't a colleague. Wasn't sure who he was. And I could tell you now, of course, his name was Jay Nichols, J.J. Nichols. And Jay Nichols was in the B'nai B'rith building, came in on March 9th, 1977. He worked for IBM. He was a Selectric. Maybe their listeners of the show didn't know they were about typewriters because of the computer age we live in. He came in to fix Selectric typewriters that day.
Oh my! Wrong place, wrong time.
You're right, George. And what happened though, which quickly had my mind change, is Latif instructed us to go down. They were going to take us downstairs to the second floor, and Norman Buckner disappeared around the stairwell. And as Jay Nichols approached the doorway, Abdul Adam took his rifle and hit him square in the face with the butt of the rifle. Broke his nose and lacerated his face, and he fell at my feet. And he was in shock and in pain, and they were screaming at him to get up, but he couldn't get up. So I bent down to try to help him, and Adam stepped out and tapped me on the shoulder with the rifle to back me back up, which I did. And they literally picked him up and threw him down the stairs. And I can tell you, George, quickly my mind went from this is not a robbery to this is something way more serious. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when he told me to move, he cursed at me and told me to move. Abdul Adam then swung the barrel of the rifle at me, hit me in the face. He broke my cheekbone in 6 places and crushed my zygomatic bone. And looked at me and told me that if I didn't get down the stairs, he'd kill me. And I was bleeding profusely. I was probably in shock for a number of seconds. I was trying to clear my head. And I decided right there, it was interesting how your mind takes over, George. Mm-hmm. And I said to myself, I'm on the 3rd floor landing. I'm just going to walk out of this building. I really thought that. And I was bleeding, and my pants now were covered. My shirt was totally covered with blood, and my head was woozy. And I started to go down that stairs, and I had my head down. And when I got down to the 2nd floor landing, the next thing I know is there was this pronounced sound, and it was me hitting chest to chest with someone that knocked him back about 4 or 5 feet and knocked me back up the stairs. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was just introduced to Hamas Abdul Khalis, the leader of the Hanafi Muslim terrorists who were now in the B'nai B'rith building. Mm. And he was just as startled as I was. And he had a 45 Colt pistol in his hand, and I guess I should be lucky he just didn't decide to shoot me while I was in the stairs. And there were a number of other terrorists, and they all started to laugh, George. They thought it was pretty funny when we bounced off each other. It was a pretty pronounced sound. We literally hit chest to chest.
Oh, my.
And he looked at me and said, go around the corner and jump on the floor. So I'm going to have your listeners just picture, George, I'm going through a doorway, and there's a landing on the 2nd floor of the B'nai B'rith building at the time that they were going to use a reception area, but they never did. It was where our fundraising operation was situated. And it was a room no more than 20 by 20, 25 by 20 at the most. It wasn't a big space. And as I came through the door, there were probably 50 or 60 of my colleagues piled on top of each other already.
Piled on top of each other.
That's correct, George. Men and women piled on top of each other.
Like
It was
stacked up like wood.
yeah, not as nicely stacked. It didn't look like a cord, I can tell you that.
Uh-huh.
Just bodies piled on top of each other, and the pile was pretty high, and there was blood on all the walls, and it was an incredibly intense, hysterical scene that was happening, and the instructions to me were to just jump on the pile, and I recognized that as I got into the pile and I sort of fell sideways. The other thing I said to myself at that point, George, I said, I'm bleeding to death, and I need to stop the bleeding, and I was going to do is force my way to the bottom of the pile to try to put my face on the floor and try to stop the bleeding. But at the same time, more people are coming on top of us as they're consolidating. They consolidated the building from 8 down to the 5th floor, and they took people from the 4th floor down to the 2nd floor. And so there were 2 piles of people, one on the 2nd floor now that I'm in, and the other pile up on the 5th floor near the elevator bank. People are piling on top of each other up there. And it was an incredible scene that was going on. And people, the terrorists screaming and yelling that everyone's going to be dying. The anti-Semitic vitriol started immediately, that it's we, the Jewish people, created all the ills of the world, and why don't we go back to where we came from? Whoever we pray to, we should pray to them because we were going to die that day. And this is the scene that was unfolding now on the 2nd floor of the B'nai B'rith building. How
many terrorists were there?
In our building, 7, George. There were 7 terrorists in our building, and it was interesting. I was working my way down to the bottom of the pile, and I got down to the bottom, and it was very difficult to breathe. It was very hard to breathe. It's just a little humorous side to it that as I hit the pile and more people were coming on top, a woman fell on top of me from our Hillel operations, and Hillel was the on college campuses, perhaps you're familiar with that. Hillel Institutions was part of B'nai B'rith at the time, and her name was Mimi Feldman, and probably in her early 50s or mid 50s, and a typical Jewish grandmother at that time. And I looked back at her, and she became hysterical when she saw my face, and she was crying and hysterical, and I reached out and grabbed her hand and told her everything will be okay. Not that I believed it, but was trying to offer her some support to try to calm her down. And she looked at me and she said, I wish I had a tissue to give you for your face. And, it was, even in that instant of fear and terror and people thinking they're going to die, people started to give support to one another, which is incredibly important.
I'll say.
And when I got down to the bottom of the pile, I was now face to face with a young man on our staff who had been severely injured. Wesley Himes was our printer, and what's interesting, the Hanafi Muslims, of course, were black men. They've been part of the Black Muslim movement, the Islam of Nation of Islam movement, and we did have a diverse staff even back in 1977. So there were a number of blacks who worked on the staff, African Americans, and Wesley was our printer, and he didn't hear the noise that was going behind him. It was remember those old printing presses, George, that made a lot of noise. He worked it by hand, and he was working that, didn't hear the commotion that was going on, and he was tapped on the shoulder by one of the terrorists, who then asked him if he was deaf and swung a machete at him.
Oh.
And Wes tried to deflect it, and he almost took his hand off. And then Wes ran from him, and one of the other terrorists then shot Wesley with a .357 Magnum. And luckily it was a clean shot through the shoulder, didn't hit bone or anything, but Wes said to me the force of that gun shot, he did like a double flip and a gainer in the air. And he became the bottom of the pile on that 2nd floor landing. And that's who I was face to face with when I got down to the bottom of the pile. And so Wesley had been macheted and shot. So it was a very, very difficult situation. And then Khalees came in, and now the person I ran into all of a sudden now is screaming at us, anti-Semitic sayings, and where were we when his babies were killed, and where were we when this and that, and all of a sudden, George, a light bulb went off in my brain. I knew who this was. Back in 1974, we were living in the Philadelphia area, where the killers of his family had come out of, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, of course, had covered that slaying and the murders and the subsequent trial in great detail. And I actually knew who this person was and couldn't believe it as I was looking at him.
So that was his main motivation for this.
These were his demands, George. So here we are now in this incredibly difficult situation. We have people above us with guns telling us we're going to be killed. We're people piled on top of each other. So you could only think they were just going to start to execute people. And the police, they show up within a fairly short period of time, and they fired their weapons down the stairwell to back the police off. And Khalees knew the police were there, so he yelled down to the police and asked who they were. And 35 years later, George, I remember the conversation vividly. And Khalees asked the policeman, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Deputy Chief Rabe." His name is Robert Rabe. And he said, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Hamas Abdul Khalees. You can call me Mr. Khalees, and I'll call you Deputy Chief Rabe." And they start to have this dialogue down the stairwell, yelling back and forth to each other. And then we heard the demands for the first time. And this will be interesting, George, because relevancy to today and even to what happened in the world a short time ago in Libya. The first demand he yells down is, "Stop that movie, Muhammad, Messenger of God, by 2 o'clock, or I'm going to chop off 10 heads."
Isn't that ironic?
How about that, George?
Uh-huh.
He basically said, and I'm going to tell you about that movie in a little bit. He said, "Stop that movie, Muhammad, Messenger of God, by 2 o'clock, or we're going to chop off 10 heads and throw them down the stairs. Bring me the killers of my family. Bring me Muhammad Ali."
Muhammad Ali?
Yeah, and that's because Muhammad Ali was a black Muslim
Uh-huh.
and part of the Nation of Islam movement. He said, "Bring me some people who had been locked up who were part of the Hanafi sect." And he also wanted $300 brought to him, and there's a story behind that as well. But this is interesting. When I started to work on my book, George, I worked on it for 2 years, and even though I was in this event and I knew exactly what was happening to me, and then I knew things were happening on the outside, and I needed to do research to pull all these things together, and I always knew about that movie, but I really didn't know about that movie. And as I did the research, it just became unbelievably ironic about it. And the movie was called Muhammad, Messenger of God, and Khalees thought it was blasphemous to the Prophet Muhammad. Sound familiar, George, to the world we live in
sure
today?
Does. Uh-huh.
So that movie was made by a producer and director. His name was Mustafa Akkad, who was a Syrian by birth and had gotten his filmmaking degrees at USC and UCLA. In his genre, he was the guy who made all the Halloween movies.
Mm.
But the first movie he ever made was called Muhammad, Messenger of God. And he couldn't get funding or interest in the United States. And finally, the Moroccan government decided to back the movie and fund it. And he went to Morocco, and the stars of the movie were Irene Pappas and Anthony Quinn.
Really?
They were the stars of this movie. And when they're in the Moroccan desert, they would film an English version, and then at the same time they would then film an Arabic version. So they were filming two different versions of this as they were doing the filming. Well, the Moroccans watched this, and then they became very nervous about what the film was about, and they stopped the funding and they stopped the filming of it, and they kicked them out of the country. Mm. And then someone else picked it up to make the rest of the movie and allow them to make the rest of it. And the person's name who did that, his name was Muammar Gaddafi.
My goodness gracious!
And so they went and finished filming the filming in Libya, and Gaddafi helped fund the remainder of the film. early 2000, George, in early 2000, and I'll get you the exact date, the Mustafa Akkad and his young daughter, 34 years old, I believe, at the time, went to Amman, Jordan for a wedding. And while they were there, they were in the Hyatt Hotel, I believe, in Amman, Jordan, and Mustafa Akkad and his young daughter were killed in an Al-Qaeda suicide bombing in Jordan. And as I found this out, George, I thought about it and said, is that circumstance, happenstance, or people with long memory?
I would tend to think that's people with long memory.
Well, you know, and I let people who read the book make their own judgment. Mm-hmm. But I've certainly asked experts, and I'll talk about Patrick Mullaney from the FBI who was involved with us. And as I asked these people what they thought, they would look at me and say, "Are you crazy? It's people with long memories." And I let people make their own judgment on that. But how ironic is that the person's film, which was part, George, of our hostage siege, happened to be killed in a terrorist attack as well, and I'm not sure I could calculate the odds on that.
No, that's got to be astronomical.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could calculate the odds on that. And so here we were, George, and the police now were recognizing that they had this huge problem on their hands. Additionally, what was happening, and we, obviously I didn't know it at the time, found out a couple of hours later because they were listening to a radio, and I heard a radio broadcast. Hamas Abdul Khalis sent two of his men to the district building, which was the seat of government of the District of Columbia, to kill the mayor of Washington at the time, Walter Washington, and to take revenge there against the district government because he felt they didn't, react properly during the trials of his family killing. And he also sent 3 terrorists to an Islamic center on Massachusetts Avenue, which in Washington is called Embassy Row. It's a beautiful building. And he was looking for the head of the Islamic Center, Dr. Roth, who was an Egyptian, and he was upset because the Egyptians were, at that time, think about that, in 1977, working on peace with the Israelis for the first time.
Uh-huh.
So he was very upset about that. He wanted to kill Dr. Ralph. The 3 men he sent to the Islamic Center had some knives and machetes with them. The 2 men that he sent to the district building had knives, and also one of them was armed with a shotgun. When they got to the district building, it's a lot different going into a building where there's police presence and also who have weapons. And when they got to the district building, the police reacted, and a gunfight ensued as the terrorists went into the district building. As the terrorist fired his shotgun, a little-known council member was coming off an elevator with a young reporter from Howard University. The little-known council member's name was Marion Barry. And he took a shotgun pellet near his heart and almost died. And the young reporter, Maurice Williams, was instantly killed. And then the 2 terrorists at the district building grabbed hostages and barricaded themselves in one of the council members' chambers, Sterling Tucker at the time. So there were about 14 or 15 hostages now at the district building. There were about a dozen hostages at this Islamic center. And when I was on the second floor landing, George, that I described, mm-hmm. I thought that everyone had been captured, but I hadn't seen colleagues I had seen that morning. So I thought everyone who was being captured was there, not knowing that more colleagues had been captured in other parts of the building. And he had captured approximately 125 colleagues at the B'nai B'rith building.
Wow.
And the police, in the beginning, didn't connect all the dots. All of a sudden, they were getting reports, George, that there was happenings around the city. And it took them a while to finally connect all the dots. that what was happening at the B'nai B'rith building, the district building, and the mosque all connected.
And this is the first time they've ever faced anything like this.
First time they ever faced anything like this. They had no idea what to do, George. And Khalid became very nervous on the second floor, and turned to us. And in fact, before he asked us where he could take us that was away from the police, he did release a number of people. One, he asked for we wanted to know where the wounded man was, and they pulled Wes out of the pile, and then he also took a few women who were very hysterical, and they were trying to control the situation, and they felt some of the situation was getting out of control. And he said to the police, "I'm going to be sending some people down," and he made each one thank Allah for their life, and then he sent them down the stairs. And then he turned to us, and this is probably an hour and a half into the event, and he asked us where he could take us. And he was also very nervous because they would yell upstairs if their men were okay, and he would say to us, "If any of my men been hurt, I'm just going to start killing people here on the second floor." And he actually pulled a woman out and sent her up the stairs to report back to him that all his men were okay. And I was thinking as she was running up the stairs, I was hoping that she was a track star and be able to get up there as quickly as possible and come back safely. And we told him to take us all to the 8th floor. And the word was passed, and they took all the people first from the 5th floor and brought them up to the 8th floor. I didn't know as I did my research. It was some horrendous things going on above us. It was certainly horrendous in the situation we were. A young man on staff, a young black male who worked in our mailroom, Alton Kirkland, had been stabbed 4 or 5 times, and he almost died. People were pistol whipped and hit with guns, men and women. People punched, and it was sheer terror that was going on in that building as they took over that building. So they took the people on the 5th floor, George, up to the 8th floor, and the 8th floor was still under construction. It was a pretty good sized room, and they had not finished construction. They only finished one side of the floor, and there were offices. But there was a pretty big conference area that was still unfinished, and it was just a cement floor and had windows but not finished at all. Took the 5th floor people at first, and then they took all the women up first in groups up the flights, and saved all the men for last. And it was interesting. This was during a time, George, 1977, where you didn't have casual Friday or casual day as any day. If you were an executive working in any kind of office building, you were wearing a tie that day. Mm-hmm. Everyone wore a tie. And as you stood up, and if you were certainly wearing a tie, it didn't matter whether you were injured. He considered you a part of the B'nai B'rith executives, and you weren't going to be released. You were being taken. And as executives and others stood up, if you had your tie on, they took your tie off, and then they tied your hands behind your back as high as they can go. Mm. And then in small groups would rush people up the stairs. I was in, George, the last group that went up. And when I stood up, I have to admit I'd been bleeding still pretty profusely for a number of hours, and I wasn't sure I could walk. I'd get up 6 flights of stairs, and the comment to us from the terrorists who took us up, there were 4 or 5 of us, that if you fell down in the stairwell, we would just kill you. And it's amazing how much adrenaline kicks in. Mm-hmm. And I was pushing the person in front of me. And when we got up to the 8th floor, George, and I came around the corner, I have to admit I couldn't believe what I saw. If the person wasn't tied up yet with their hands behind them, and they basically tied up the men, they didn't tie up the women, but people were holding on to the ankles of the person in front of them, and everyone's lying on the floor face down. And when I came through the doorway, off the stairwell, and I was handed off to another terrorist with a shotgun, and I couldn't believe it. There were 125 of my colleagues lying face down on the ground, and many people just holding on to the ankles of the person in front of them. It was pretty astounding to see that.
That had to be one horrific sight.
It was unbelievable that many people had been captured. Khalid came up, And what they did is they brought the elevators down, George. They took the elevators from the second floor and brought them up to the 8th floor and cut them off. And then they were very nervous, of course, about the police. They were very nervous that the police were going to set up snipers across in other buildings. There was a Holiday Inn across the street from the B'nai B'rith building and other office buildings. And they started to cover up the windows as quickly as possible. They asked young men on staff under the age of 30 to call out. And what was going to happen is young men on the B'nai B'rith staff under the age of 30 were being drafted to serve on work crews. And these work crews were going to take apart the entire B'nai B'rith building. Literally, desks, chairs, cabinets. If things were bolted down, they were ripped out. And almost instantaneously, they had these work crews start to go down through the building and stopped up the stairwells from the second floor all the way up to the roof of the building, filled with furniture, office equipment, anything that they could put into the stairwells. So both stairwells in the B'nai B'rith building were stopped up. And these work crews worked from probably about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, March 9th, all the way probably through 11 o'clock or midnight. And so think about this, George. When the work crews were done, the elevators were cut off. There was no way in and no way out.
Oh, you're just like you're just hanging there. You're out there.
We're stuck, and the police are still trying to figure out what to do, George, and how to handle this thing. It was interesting. I did yell out. I was 27 years of age at the time, and I have to admit I was glad I got to the 8th floor because I finally was able to lie on a cement floor and press my face against the floor, and I finally was able to start to stem the bleeding and stop the bleeding. And I yelled out when they asked young men of 30, and the youngest terrorist, his name was Abdul Hamid, who was 23 years old at the time, I believe a West Point preparatory dropout, came over and kicked me in the ribs and to get up because I yelled out, and I turned and looked at him, and he looked at me and he said to me, "Oh man, get back down. Your face is too messed up." But he used a much more vernacular term to get me back on the floor. So I didn't have to serve on the work crews because I had been too severely injured in their mind.
Uh-huh.
And these work crews were working all over. And I also had colleagues, George, there were colleagues who heard noise and barricaded themselves in offices. There were some who made very good decisions. I had a close colleague, his name was Laurie Kaplan, who was in charge of the insurance program, and Laurie had served in the Army, and his office is on the 3rd floor, but he was visiting someone else on the 5th. When you heard all this commotion and noise, and someone came and said there was a gunman in the building, Laurie grabbed about 15 people and escorted everyone into one office, closed the door, and had everyone push all the furniture up against the door. And Laurie's Army training, and you served in the Army, George, in Vietnam, and would probably relate to this. And Laurie's training told him, never walk into a situation you're not aware of.
Uh-huh.
And he wasn't aware of what was going on, so he wanted to actually take people with him and then try to figure out what to do. And Laurie's action saved about 15 of our colleagues from being held hostage.
Wow.
And they were barricaded, and the terrorists couldn't get to them.
Did the terrorists know they were there?
They knew where some people were, and they were still trying to find people. As the work crews worked, George, they were trying doors and trying to find people.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the doors they just couldn't get through. Other doors they shot the locks off as they were looking at offices. I had one colleague. It was a horrendous situation we were going through. I had one colleague. His name was Errol Imber, who heard the noise, and his office was at sort of a far end of the 5th floor. He stepped out and saw this commotion, went back in his office, closed the door and locked the door and sat down. And they never came, and at one point he thought that someone was trying his door, but he just sat at his desk, holding his breath, couldn't turn any lights, and these were the old phones. Remember the old phones? If you picked the phone up, lights would show, right?
Uh-huh.
So he was afraid that if he picked up the phone, maybe the light would be out by the secretarial area. So he never picked up the phone to try to call anyone. And Errol sat in his office and he had no idea what was going on, George. He just knew something bad had happened. And he was at his office alone from 11 o'clock in the morning, and the police finally were able to release people up to about the 5th floor late at night or early 2 o'clock Thursday morning, and Errol was all alone in his office, not knowing what was going on, until he was rescued by the police probably about 2 o'clock Thursday morning. And actually the story about that has a little humor to it in the sense of that he didn't know. Here he was in the dark, though the police had seen him from another building, so they were pointing out where people were located in offices that had barricaded. And when they were finally able to make the rescue attempt, here it is, totally dark, and he hears a knock on his door. And they say, "We know you're in there." And he thought it was the terrorist. And they said, "It's the police. We want you to open the door and then get on the floor." Because they still didn't know who was who, George. The police were unsure. And so they said to him, "We want you to open the door and get down on the floor and don't move." And he had enough presence in his mind. Errol said to them, "Well, prove you're the police." And one of the policemen put his badge underneath the door. And Errol saw the badge. And then he unlocked the door and got down on the floor, and they burst in, and they roughly pulled him up. And he was now looking at men. These were SWAT team guys wearing blue uniforms, right, with big guns. And this group, George, happened to be all blonde and blue-eyed. And Errol's mind said the following: the B'nai B'rith building has been taken over by the American Nazi Party. That's what he thought. Because he didn't know. And he's looking at these guys who are big and blonde and blue-eyed. He thought, but that's just how people were thinking at the time. So the police were able to rescue a number of colleagues as they saw where they were in the building. But there was no way that at that point they could get up to the 8th floor and rescue us. So the police were totally baffled. They now connected the dots. They knew that someone had been killed, which escalates this thing at the district building. They really didn't know what was going on in the B'nai B'rith building. They didn't know how many terrorists actually were in the building. They had no idea how many weapons they had, George. And it was an incredibly difficult situation. Finally, they decided, when they knew it was Hamas Abdul Khalis, it was outside the realm of their expertise in dealing with the Islamic religion. And they reached out to a gentleman by the name of Armin Meyer, who was an ambassador to Lebanon and Iran and a number of other Arab countries. And after the 72 Olympics, when that really was the first message about terror, and the interesting thing about that 72 Olympics, George, when I was lying on the floor on the 2nd floor, one of the other things I thought about, the summer before, I had read the book about the massacre of the Jewish athletes at the Munich Olympics. And the book that I read describes in vivid detail the violent takeover of the apartment complex where the Israeli athletes were housed. And I couldn't believe it, George. I was thinking, I am living that book today.
Was there a lot of similarities between what happened to the Israelis?
Well, unfortunately, the killing of them was very quick. They killed a number of them as they came in. But the violent takeover of the apartment complex was very similar to what we were experiencing. And that book I read in the summer of 76 came vividly through my mind about what we were living through. And here we are now, George, up there and the police are trying to figure out. So they reached out to Armin Meyer, and Armin Meyer quickly realized, Armin Meyer then became the first person at the State Department who was asked by President Nixon to work on a task force on terrorism in the early 70s. And Armin Meyer then got the call from the police to help out. And Armin Meyer reached out to 3 Islamic ambassadors. One Islamic, actually, and 2 Arab ambassadors. He reached out to Ambassador Zahidi, who was the ambassador from Iran to the United States at the time. Ardeshir Zahidi was the Shah's son-in-law. He'd also been ambassador to Great Britain. and had been foreign minister of Iran. And Zahidi's father was also foreign minister of Iran when he was a young man and a famous politician in Iran. But here was the Shah's son-in-law that he reached out to. He reached out to Ambassador Goebel from Egypt and also Ambassador Yabak Khan from Pakistan. Ardashir Zahidi happened to be in France visiting a friend who was dying of cancer at the time, and he got the call from Armin Meyer to get back to Washington as quickly as possible. And Zahidi reached out to Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was president of France at the time. They arranged for transportation for him back to Paris, and he caught the Concorde. The Concorde was just operating at that time, and because of the quick flight back, he was able to get back to Washington. So they reached out to 3 Islamic ambassadors to help out. The FBI also became involved because the police reached out to the FBI, recognizing the extent of what was going on. How many experts, George, do you think existed in the FBI in 1977 on terrorism and hostage negotiation?
Not many. Not
2.
2. That's it. 2.
That was it. Two experts. And one of them, Patrick Mullaney, was one of the first FBI experts on terrorism and profiling and hostage negotiation. And in fact, was finishing up a hostage incident that was developing in a bank in Cleveland. And Patrick Mullaney got the call from the assistant FBI director that he needed to get back to Washington as quickly as possible. So Patrick grabbed a plane from Cleveland to get back to Washington, and the ambassadors were all getting back to Washington, and they were going to be merging into a team. They just didn't know it at the time. It was interesting. Here's Patrick Mullaney, the FBI expert. He lands in Washington, and he says he could tell there's this chaos in the city. You know, when we got up to the 8th floor, George, all we can hear, of course, are sirens and helicopters, and you knew something big was happening in the city. So I certainly knew what was happening in front of me, that I'm being threatened with death by these terrorists along with my colleagues, specifically because we're Jewish, and the anti-Semitic things that were being said. Mm-hmm. And I had nothing, I felt bad about the killings of his family, but I had nothing to do with the killings of his family, George.
Right.
And certainly I had nothing to do with that movie or other things that he was saying. What he was saying is that because of my religion, I had helped create all the ills of the world, mm-hmm. and that I was going to pay for that along with my colleagues. Mm-hmm. So finally, on Wednesday afternoon, the ambassadors and the FBI and Patrick Mullaney, when he got to Washington, George, he wanted to get over. He had heard about the B'nai B'rith building and other things, but he wasn't sure exactly what was going on because he hadn't been fully briefed. And he got into a cab and asked the cab driver to take him to the district building. And the cab driver said to him, "Are you crazy? Do you know what's going on in this city?" And then the cab driver filled him in about the B'nai B'rith building, about the mosque. And the cab driver wouldn't take him, and Patrick showed him his FBI credentials. And the cab driver took him, and they cleared about 2 or 3 different barricades and got him as close to the district building that the cab driver felt comfortable. And Patrick got out, and when Patrick got to the district building, the first thing he noticed was a body lying in front of the district building covered with a cloth. And that was Maurice Williams, the young reporter who had been killed. He also saw Marion Barry on a stretcher. Didn't know it was Marion Barry at the time, and saw obviously this person had been shot. And in Patrick's mind, anytime you have such someone who is killed and other shooting victims, it escalates the situation tremendously. And he was very, very concerned immediately about what he was facing. And Patrick did make his way up a little bit into the district building, and then finally made his way to the police command center that had been set up. And that's finally where Patrick and the ambassadors, and they called on some other people. Steve Kurzniak is a world-renowned psychiatrist who worked at the State Department, got pulled in. So there were people being pulled in for the first time ever to try to figure out how to handle this situation.
this had to be a nightmare for the authority. I mean, I know it's a nightmare for the people that's been taken hostage, but it has to be a nightmare logistically for the authorities.
They had no idea, George. There was chaos for them as well. They really had no idea how many terrorists, how many weapons, how many people perhaps had been killed in the B'nai building or at the mosque. They knew there was a death and a council member had been shot at the district building. It was very, very difficult for them to handle. And they were and remember, and we talked about this a little bit before we went on the air, is a very different world we lived in.
Yes.
This was a world of no internet. There were no cable TV stations. There was no instantaneous news. There were no cell phones. So it was way different in terms of how they were processing information that they were getting. The things that were going on in the B'nai building were pretty incredible. It was interesting. A couple of things I just wanted to share with you. One is they didn't want to know anyone's name, and they didn't really want to know anyone's personal story. But if they had to kill you, they don't want to know about that.
That was nice of them. That was really nice of them.
And they never really called in. They never asked your name or wanted to call anyone out by name. Mm-hmm. But when Khalis came up to the 8th floor, he took over an office to serve as his office. That he was going to use as his command center. Uh-huh. And he came out. We knew what office he picked by this thing that he did. He came out and he said, "Who is David Brody?" That's what he asked. He said, "Who is David Brody?" And David Brody, George, was the Anti-Defamation League's top lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And we used to joke with David, an incredibly bright man who was involved in the civil rights movement, who was involved in all kinds of human rights issues. Even back in the 30s and 40s, he was a trained attorney, incredibly bright. And we used to joke that here's this little 5'6" Jewish guy with a big brain, and he came out and said, "Who is David Brody?" And David happened to be captured, and no one said a word. And Khalis was getting angry and said, "Who is David Brody?" And so finally Brody said me, and by that time Brody's arms had been tied behind his back with his necktie, and Khalis walked, and David was all the way in the back towards the back wall, and Khalis sort of weaved his way through all the people lying on the floor, and was heading towards Brody, and a number of the women started to scream because they thought he was just going to kill David because he had asked for him. Uh-huh. And people were screaming, not to kill David. And he got very close to David and looked down on him, and very quietly, George, this is what he said to him. He said, and remember, this is David Brody, who was the Anti-Defamation League's top lobbyist, who worked with U.S. presidents, every U.S. president since Franklin Roosevelt. There was Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, all these presidents he personally knew, and U.S. senators, and had pictures, obviously, of himself with all these people. And Khalis walked up to him and looked at him and said, "Mr. Brody, knowing U.S. presidents won't help you now," and walked out of the room.
Wow.
It was a point well taken.
I imagine, yes.
It was well taken. And think about this also. People were getting sick, Mm-hmm. People have illnesses that you didn't know about. One of my colleagues, who was the magazine editor, a very, very bright guy. His name's Charlie Fenyvesi, Harvard educated, and had grown up in Hungary. It occurred to me when I was lying on the floor at that time, there were colleagues, George, who were on the floor with me who had survived the Holocaust.
Oh.
And I found it hard to comprehend what they were going through. And certainly what we were living through, George, paled in comparison to what the Holocaust was, in terms of people living in degradation and threats of death for years and years of their lives, and of course 6 million people not surviving mm-hmm. the event. But there were people lying with me on that floor, close colleagues, who had survived the Holocaust, and I could not comprehend what they were thinking at that time. Charlie Fenyvesi had survived the Holocaust as a young child and had been protected. in his family had put him with a non-Jewish family to protect him. And we didn't know it, but all of a sudden he was lying near me, and he started to hallucinate. And Charlie was screaming, "You people can't keep me here any longer. I'm getting out of here." And he was tied up. His arms were tied behind his back, and he wasn't going anywhere. And we didn't realize he was going into a diabetic shock at the time. He had diabetes. So a number of the women started screaming that, he was dying, and they needed to do something. Because it was a construction area where we were, one of the terrorists found an old orange. And so the women were sort of passing this orange over their heads towards Charlie. And as the orange got to Charlie and one of the women was about to feed it to him, Khalees came back in the room and said, "Don't feed him that orange." And then people started yelling, "He's dying. We got to give him something." And Khalees' comment was, "That orange is dirty. Go wash it off before you feed it to him."
Doesn't that...
And he still, think about that, the Islamic food base is like kosher, that, in terms of the kosher food and Islamic food, that the cleanliness of it and stuff. Mm-hmm. So he literally made one of the women go into the bathroom and clean the orange off before they fed it to Charlie. So there were some incongruous things that were happening a little bit already. If they were going to kill us, why would they feed the orange?
Yes. And
part of that, George, was he didn't want anyone dying on him until he made that decision. Because what would have been the police reaction if he said, "Well, I'm sending this body down," or "We've had someone die on us"? The police reaction would have been way different as the event unfolded.
Uh-huh.
And it was interesting. Another colleague, there were things going on, George, that were acts of bravery among colleagues that was just incredible, even in that very, very difficult situation. He came out, and B'nai B'rith had installed a brand new Citrix phone system, the state-of-the-art at the time, but no one knew how to work it. So if we couldn't work it, then certainly Hamas Abdul Khalees couldn't work it either. And he came out, he was very frustrated and angry, and he said, "I need someone to work the phone system for me," and no one said a word. And now he was becoming pretty agitated. And he said, I asked, "I need someone to work this phone system." And finally this woman, one of our colleagues, her name was Betty Jean Neal, everyone loved her and called her BJ. And she was the assistant to the Human Relations Director, Dale Bell, and a 48-year-old woman, very attractive, tough as anything. And BJ looked at this man and said to him, "I'll answer your damn phones for you." and Khalees looked at her and sort of was amused at her reaction. And he looked at her and he said to her, "Are you Jewish?" And BJ was not. I believe she was Methodist or Baptist. And BJ said, "No, I'm not Jewish." And his comment to her was, "Well, good, because I don't want any Jewish answering my phones."
Mm.
And he extracted BJ, and we did not see BJ again for another 36 hours.
Wow.
And she served as his secretary, and BJ placed calls all over the world for him, answered calls, and it was her clear-headed thinking and her ability to know who, when he said, "Call this person for me," or "Get me a number for this," to the district building, BJ was able to do that. The other thing that was happening, George, is that the media influence and media participation in this event was unbelievable. Once the lines were established, media were calling in from all over the world to talk to Khalees. He was talking to newspaper people, to radio people, to TV people from all over the world, and particularly within the Washington market. And some of that interaction with the media was putting us into danger. He would get calls from media who would say to him, "Why do you think you can trust the police?" Or, "Do you know there are snipers across the way in buildings?" And each of those times he would go crazy and then get on the phone with the police and say, "Get those snipers off the wall or I'm going to start killing people." Or do this or do that. So the media action during this event was pretty amazing.
It was putting you in I mean, you were already in jeopardy, but this was just making it worse.
It was putting us in greater jeopardy. And in fact, there was, and I was able to interview him for the book. There was a radio personality in the Washington market. His name was Jim Bohannon. And he worked for WTOP, and he was covering the affair for a long time. Jim got through to Khalees and got him on the phone, and Jim made some terrible mistakes in that conversation. Jim called Hamas Abdul Khalees a black Muslim. Mm-hmm. And it was the black Muslims that had killed his family. And Hamas Abdul Khalees said to him, because of your mistake, I'm going to go back in that room and I'm going to kill 10 people.
Ooh.
And the only way for you to rectify this is for you to go on the radio and personally apologize for what you did, and then I want you to go on TV and to apologize as well. And if Bohannon hadn't done that, would Khalees have come in and killed people? We could surmise about that, but he was angry enough, perhaps he would have.
And Jim Bohannon, he's still, excuse me, he's still on the radio.
Yeah, in fact, I reached out to Jim, and we exchanged emails as I wrote the book, and Jim actually confirmed what happened and said, yes, his comment to me was that he stepped into a bucket of cloud poop. That's what he told me as he did this. So here we have this thing going on. Now the FBI and the Islamic ambassadors are involved, and the Islamic ambassadors, George, they called in experts on the Quran. They were trying to reason with Khalees through the Quran and sayings, and they were having great difficulty getting through, and he was not listening to them. And so these conversations were taking place all through Wednesday evening. No food or water for the hostages all through Wednesday. Very difficult situation. Threats of death. They finally split the men and women and put them on both sides of the room. And they settled us in for a long siege. A number of things happened during the evening. We heard Khalees yell down the stairs because obviously he heard the police working their way up to. He didn't know they were releasing people, but he fired his weapon down a number of times. They had also set up a little room for all their supplies, and they would take breaks. And they kept 2 terrorists on us, heavily armed, sitting in chairs the whole time in between the hostages. And one of the terrorists went, I guess, to lie down and take a nap and close his eyes. And the next thing that happened, this was about 2 o'clock Thursday morning, and a huge explosion occurred, and dust came out of the room. And it was interesting, the reaction. The terrorists who were in the room with us at that time, we watched them, they all fell on the floor. The only person, George, who ran into that room with no hesitation was Khalees. He was fearless. He ran in. What had happened? One of his men, as I mentioned, went in to take a nap, and he went to sleep with a .357 Magnum on his hip. And the safety was not on, and the gun discharged. And it blew a hole in the wall.
Oh.
But it scared everyone, I can tell you that.
I would imagine.
So this took us through Wednesday. It was incredibly violent. It was very difficult. People were becoming ill. In this kind of situation, also, George, everyone's equal. Didn't matter how much money you made. Didn't matter what your title in life was.
Yes. Everyone
is equal. And what's interesting is it did create some difficulty among colleagues afterwards, because senior executives were held. The president of the organization and the top lay lead, the president and the executive vice president, were not captured. So and the executive vice president in charge of administration. So the top 3 people were not hostages with us, but they did have senior people as well. So people who thought they could look towards senior people because of the title and who they were and who they thought they were, and that wasn't particularly the case. Just because you had a high title didn't mean that you were prepared for this kind of situation. And in fact, some of the senior people were causing difficulty because they were complaining. They would say, "Don't you know who I am?" And you would say, "Be quiet. They don't care who you are." And it was interesting where where the equality issue came out at times where one senior executive who always thought very highly of himself was complaining to the terrorist, and the terrorist were really becoming agitated at this comment that he was making. And one of the young men in the mailroom turned to him and told him to shut his mouth. and it was sort of like, good for you, David, that you did that. But there was this huge equality issue because it didn't matter about what you did in life. We were all equal, George.
Uh-huh.
This was happening. And every time they used the elevators, and they did, what happened, they were able to negotiate coffee and donuts for Thursday morning because no one had food or anything. But before I do that, if I have time, George, I have to tell you that the bathroom situation is pretty interesting. You know, people do ask about that.
Oh yeah.
They allowed the women to go right away, and you know, the old joke about, of course, that women line up at sporting events, and it was even true in a hostage situation, George, and we sort of laughed about it because the line for the women to get into the restroom was pretty long. The men was different. They didn't let the men go right away, and when they finally did, way late Wednesday, what they did is they untied the hands of what they called the old men, George, and these were people over the age of 50. So if you were over the age of 50 at the time, you were considered an old man, and you were going to be the first to die. But before that, you would help out if they needed you, and so they would ask the older men to help someone get up, particularly when your hands are tied behind your back and you're weak. It was tough to get up. Mm-hmm. And so if you needed to go to the men's room, you tried to get up by yourself or you got help, and then you walked across the floor, and then you put your head against the wall at a 45-degree angle, and one of the terrorists came up and put either a shotgun or a semi-automatic carbine rifle in the back of your neck while they untied your hands, and then led you into the bathroom. And I observed this on Wednesday, George, throughout watching my colleagues do this, and I quickly determined that I was not going to go too often, that it didn't seem worth the experience. Mm-hmm. And I finally went one time to the men's room during the entire experience, and it was actually sometime on Thursday. And one of the things they did was totally harangue the person when they were up there. And it was the typical, what's called the Elders of Zion. It's a book that came out of Prussia about the Jews and how bad the Jews were. And they would say to you, why don't you go back to where you came from? Because the assumption was you came from Prussia or Eastern Europe and places like that. And I actually, my grandfather, Herman, came from England. He was born in England, London, England, and moved to the United States when he was 4 years old. He was born in 1898. And he always used to kid with me when I was a kid growing up in Miami. My grandfather Herman used to say to me, if that boat ride was 25 cents more to America, I would be a limey today. That's what he used to say to me. And when I went up, the one time I went up, and I knew that I was going to hear this, why don't you go back where you came from, and they were going to ask me where I came from, and they were expecting to hear Prussia or Eastern Europe or someplace. And when the terrorist asked me the question, I knew it was coming. And he said, where are you from? And he didn't mean Washington, D.C. or Maryland. And I said, London, England. He had nothing to say to me. And I silently thanked my grandfather Herman for that wonderful story he always shared with me. He saved me some aggravation that morning. But Thursday morning, they negotiated coffee and donuts, and they set one of the elevators down, and all the terrorists, George, concentrated their firepower on that elevator because they thought the police would be on the elevator. Coffee and donuts. Then the elevator opened up, and then there would be a sigh of relief. They took the coffee and donuts out. The women got the coffee and donuts. The men, we had a sip of coffee and one little donut. And the older men were feeding us that, and they had fear in their faces as they were doing it, but were compassionate to everyone as they were doing that, George. And all through Thursday, George, incredible tension. They would see snipers. They tied all the men's feet for the first time. They took all the men's wallets, as an example, and put them in a big bucket. And I watched that carefully, and I'm thinking, George, why are they doing that? And then it occurred to me, if they needed to start killing people, there was an easy way to pick people out.
Mm-hmm.
They now had your wallet and your name. They thought the police were going to be rushing in. The police and the ambassadors and the FBI were not getting through to Khalid at all. Ambassador Zahidi always felt that he needed to try to meet Khalid face to face, because they were very frustrated. The ambassadors felt they weren't helping, and they were afraid of what was going to be happening. And Ambassador Zahidi pressed Maurice Cullinane, the police chief for the District of Columbia at the time, to allow him to try to meet face to face, and they refused. They weren't going to put the ambassadors at risk. And Khalid, all through Wednesday, all through Thursday, just would say to the ambassadors, "You're trying to trick me," and they would quote the Quran, and they would talk about compassion and do kinds of things. And the police still didn't know all the information. It wasn't until early Thursday morning, one of my colleagues, Nick Siegel, who was one of our PR guys at the time, he had suffered a serious heart attack the previous September, and he looked like he was going to die. And Khalid finally decided to let him go, because I think Khalid thought he was going to die also, because he looked terrible. And it wasn't until Hank was released that the police were able to interview someone who was up on the 8th floor and truly knew what was going on. They had no idea until Thursday morning, George, how many terrorists and what was. They showed Hank at the hospital 3 pictures. And they said, "Do you recognize these people?" And Hank said, "Yes." And they said, "Good." And then he goes, "Where's the other 4? And they said, "What other 4? They had no idea, George.
So they were at the assumption that there was only 3.
That's correct. That's correct.
What?
So,
I'm sorry. What?
No, go ahead.
What's going on over at the mosque all this time?
At the mosque, it's relatively calm. They have about 13 or 14 hostages, with 3 terrorists and with some machetes,
mm-hmm.
hold up at the mosque, and the police obviously have that building surrounded. The police obviously have the building surrounded at the district building, very tense there because of the killing and the shooting.
Yes.
And also they during the shooting, they had turned around and fired their weapon at the hostages, and one of the hostages, Robert Pierce, was hit in the back and shot and paralyzed. So the district building, they knew they had a very difficult situation with terrorists that had killed someone and wounded people. Mm-hmm. And they knew they had a serious situation at the B'nai B'rith building. They didn't know if there was any killings had occurred, but they knew of gunshot victims and stabbing victims, and people being brutalized. So they knew they had this incredibly difficult situation going on. And so they're not getting through to Khalid, and so the police need to make plans. And it was interesting. This tells you the different world we were living in, the different times. There was a hotel next to the B'nai B'rith building called the Gramercy Hotel, which all of us used to frequent for coffee or lunches with people. And that's where the police set up their command center for the operations at the B'nai B'rith building. And to this day, I always ask my wife, how'd you get to the Gramercy Hotel? She actually got to the Gramercy Hotel on Thursday, along with other family members.
Well, this was all going on.
Well, it's all going on, George. And I always said to Jane, I said, how did you get there? She goes, I think I drove. I said, no, you didn't drive. There were barricades. But she must have walked there. There was a Foundry Methodist church. It's a church where Bill Clinton actually used for his observance when he was president. And it's a very beautiful church on 16th Street, not far from the B'nai B'rith building. And that's where they set up for the families to be. And I believe she and other family members just were able to talk their way to the Gramercy Hotel. And they were listening to the plans that the SWAT team had developed to save us. There was actual conversations about that on Thursday afternoon, because they weren't sure whether it was going to be a negotiated settlement.
And your wife heard this?
My wife and the family members there heard the plans being discussed by the SWAT team and the police commanders.
That's incredible.
And when they heard the plan, the family members started arguing with the police that they couldn't do it. And my wife said people became so upset that they finally left the Gramercy Hotel. And the plan was the following. They were going to drop a SWAT team on the roof of the B'nai B'rith building. and they were going to enter in three ways. They were going to use a satchel charge to blow a hole through the roof and drop a SWAT team members through the roof of the building on the 8th floor. They knew the stairwells were stopped up. They weren't sure how far, but there was obviously a door that led to the roof. They were going to grenade their way through the door to come down the stairwell. And then a number of team members were going to rappel through the windows on the 8th floor. And they had worked up casualty figures in terms of how many hostages perhaps would be killed and potentially policemen as well. And obviously it was going to be a shoot-to-kill mission when they came in.
Uh-huh.
That was the plan to rescue us. Go ahead, George.
I can understand why the families got quite upset when they heard the plans.
George. Very upset when they heard the plans.
Yeah, there wasn't too much of a chance that everyone was coming out.
No, and Patrick Mullaney, the FBI expert, went to the commander of the SWAT team and begged him not to implement the plan. And when I met Patrick and we talked about the event, and of course he filled me in what was going on in negotiations, and I'll talk a little bit if we have time about Patrick and Archer Zahidi. And Patrick pleaded with the commander of the SWAT team not to initiate the plans because he believed it was going to be a bloodbath. And when Ambassador Zahidi heard the plan, he became doubly concerned and doubled his efforts to convince Maurice Cullinane to try to let him see Hamas Abdul Khalis on a face-to-face basis. And it was interesting when I met the ambassador and I went to Switzerland where the ambassador is still alive. He's 83 years old and a wonderful human being. And here's this opportunity to see someone who negotiated for your life. And we spent 3 days together in Montreux, Switzerland, where he lives. And he agreed to be interviewed. And I asked him, I said, well, did you know, Mr. Ambassador, what the rescue plan was? And he goes, oh, of course. He said, they were going to blow a hole through the roof. And that was his explanation. The interesting thing also, think about this, George. Think about this. I asked the ambassador, I knew the answer, but I wanted him to confirm it. I said to him, when you came into we were asked to be part of the negotiating team, did you need to ask the Shah for permission? And he said, of course. So he hunted on the Shah because he was in France and he needed to talk to his king, and he was able to finally hunt down the Shah and told the Shah he was needed back in Washington, and said to the Shah, if this puts you and Iran at that time into a bad position, I will resign my ambassadorship and go as an individual.
Oh my!
Because I need to save lives. And the Shah said to him, of course not, you will go as the ambassador and representative of Iran to negotiate for those lives.
So he was going anyways.
Absolutely. But he got approval from the highest level of the king.
Mm-hmm.
And Goebbels needed to call Sadat, and the Pakistani ambassador needed to call the leader of Pakistan at the time.
Wow.
And so here they're trying to get through on Thursday. They're trying to get through, and negotiations are very difficult. It's incredibly difficult for us up on the 8th floor, obviously difficult for the other hostages in the other buildings. And they finally negotiate additional food to be brought up late Thursday afternoon. And they finally sent up, they negotiated for sandwiches and Cokes and other drinks. And the police felt they might not have many chances to do that. So they literally packed that elevator with as much food as they could. And once again, all that terror and drama played out as the elevator went down and came back up, and they were afraid that police were going to be on there. And it was packed with food. And I always remember the second in command, Abdul Latif, and it took them probably 15 minutes to unpack the elevator with all the food that they shipped up.
Uh-huh.
And they're bringing the food out and they're putting it in the center of the floor, of the 8th floor between us. And Abdul Latif looked at all of us and said, this is going to stop soon. He says, what the hell do you people think I am, your caterer? And we all thought that was pretty funny. He thought he was our caterer. But this was late afternoon, and it was very, very difficult still. And all of a sudden, their mood changed, and we weren't sure why. That's when, for the first time, they tied all the men's feet, and Khalees came in as they were tying all the men's feet, George, and his comment was, tie their feet because we don't want them bunny hopping around when the shooting starts.
Oh.
That was the comment. And in my mind, you look for rational things, right, to keep hope up and to try to get through it. And I'm thinking, well, they don't. When the shooting starts, they're going to direct all their shooting at the police, and they don't want us running around through this thing. At the same time, now all of a sudden, your hands are tied way up high, and your feet are tied. And if one of the younger terrorists, who perhaps wasn't going to direct their fire at the police, it'd be very easy for them just to take out as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. And that certainly was in our minds. And the terrorists saw more police activity Thursday afternoon because they were getting ready for that rescue plan, George. They were getting their assets in place. Go ahead, George.
Did the FBI man, excuse me, the FBI negotiator, did he ever tell you how close it was for the plan to be sprung into action?
Yes, and this next piece of the story, you'll know about it.
Okay.
But no, Patrick did confirm that. Even though his pleading, they still were getting their assets in place. They had captured during the hostage initial takeover, George, the assistant building engineer, John, and whenever they heard creaks in the building or noise, they'd say, John, they'd ask him, what's that? And he'd say, it's the air conditioner unit, it's that. At about 5 o'clock Thursday afternoon on March 10th, George, there was this huge thump on the roof. Incredibly pronounced. A huge thump on the roof. And the second in command, Latif, was sitting watching us at the time with another terrorist. And everyone's eyes went up and looked at that ceiling. And Latif's looking at the ceiling along with us. And then he looks finally back at the assistant engineer, John, and very quietly said, hey, was that the air conditioning unit? And everyone started to laugh because we knew it wasn't. Because the police had landed a SWAT team on the roof. Mm. And you knew it, you could hear it, and you knew something was up. And for the first time, they truly went into action that we hadn't seen. They brought out guns we hadn't seen before. They brought out ammunition belts that we hadn't seen before. Now, you were in the Army, George, so you would recognize this. I was not. And you know what a banana clip is, right?
Yes.
Right. So for the listeners who don't, we could describe that. It's an ammunition clip that has 32 rounds, and it looks like a banana. Mm-hmm. And this is what they were doing, George, on Thursday about 7 o'clock in the evening. They were calmly sitting there, the terrorists, with each with an ammunition belt, taking these banana clips out. I wasn't in the Army, so I was fascinated. I was watching this, crisscrossing the belt, crisscrossing the banana clips, mm-hmm. and you probably know what I'm going to tell you next.
Yes.
And then taking tape and taping them together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then, so I quickly then ascertained what was going to happen. They could fire off the 32 rounds, just turn the clip, fire another 32 without having to reach for an ammunition belt.
Right.
This is what the terrorists were doing on Thursday, about 6, 7 o'clock in the evening. And there's no question in my mind they were getting ready for a fight with the police. It also became apparent to me that they were very serious. I saw Latif go around to all the other terrorists, and he had a little pad with him. Each one wrote a note, ripped off the pad, and put it in their pocket. And I sat back and said, oh, my God, I can't believe what's happening. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until afterwards after the whole event was over, and I was being interviewed by the police captain to take my statement at the time. And I said to him, what about the notes? And he looked at me and said, how do you know about the notes? And I said, well, I saw them write the notes, so I want you to confirm it. He goes, yeah, when it was over, we got the notes. They had sent, they had wrote that note to Allah and put it in their pocket. And that's what they were doing Thursday. early evening.
So there was no doubt in their mind that this was just the way it was going to end.
Yeah. I mean, and negotiations were not going well. And I'm not sure how much the other terrorists knew how much Khalis was saying to the the police and FBI and the ambassadors, whether he was just doing that alone. BJ was listening to these conversations, so she was aware, and at certain times he would move her away when he was having conversations, so she wasn't totally aware of everything. And she was with him. We did not see her as this was going on. And they thought the police were coming in, George, and then Ambassador Zahedi finally convinced the police, and Patrick Mullaney agreed that their only way to potentially save our lives was for some kind of face-to-face meeting that would take place. And Khalis originally was not agreeable to that because they felt that the police were going to try to trick him. And so the ambassadors kept working to gain his trust, and they finally convinced him that they need to meet face-to-face. And he finally agreed, and then it took a whole bunch of negotiation on what he could bring down to the meeting. He wanted to come down armed with a gun, and they said no. He says, at least I need to come armed in some way, and they let him bring a knife with him. They set up a table in the lobby of the B'nai B'rith building, and the participants were going to be Ahmad Abdul Khalis. It was going to be the three Islamic ambassadors, Maurice Cullinane, the chief of police, and Robert Rabe, who was the deputy chief of police. Those were the people who were going to sit down with Ahmad Abdul Khalis to negotiate for our lives. And he finally agreed to it. We did not know that he was going down for this meeting. His men did, and he came down, and it was a very difficult negotiation with him. And it took Ardeshir Zahedi finally telling a story about his grandmother that got through to Khalis to offer compassion. He told the story about how when his grandfather, who was a leader of a tribe in Iran, went out to see enemies to talk with them, and while he was there, and these discussions happened on horseback back then, his grandfather was killed by one of the other tribal leaders, and subsequently, Ardeshir Zahedi's grandfather's tribe, they found and caught killers and brought them back to their area so that they could be executed. But before they executed them, they brought the killers of his grandfather to his grandmother so that she could see them. And the grandmother said to the people, I do not want these people killed. I'm going to show them compassion. And this is the story that Ardeshir Zahedi, the ambassador to Iran, the Shah's son-in-law, related to Hamas Abdul Khalis that finally broke through for him to negotiate our release.
Wow.
And so then it took a while for the deal to be done because there were a couple of restrictions. Khalis did not want to go to jail because that's where the killers of his family were, in jail, and he didn't want to be treated that way.
Uh-huh.
And he wanted to be released on his own personal recognizance and go home. All his men, though, were going to be arrested as this deal came through. And so it took a while for the D.C. government and federal authorities to approve the deal, particularly that he was going to be released on his own personal recognizance. In the end, the deal went through, and we didn't know it at the time, and we just heard all of a sudden this elevator moving, and we didn't know what was going on. I could tell you at that time when Khalis was downstairs and we didn't know what was going on, and we thought the police were coming in. This is the mentality we were at, George. All the men, we passed word to each other. Now, all our hands are tied and our feet are tied. And this is what we said to each other. Keep your left side down and your right side up because you might be able to survive a gunshot wound on the right side, but not your left side because of your heart. if someone came in, George, and took a picture of all the men who were against the wall during that time, it looked like a shark's fin, with everyone having their left side and head down and their right side up. That's the mentality we were at.
At least you were still thinking.
and that's what happens. You do.
Yeah.
You look at the things you need to do. And we were doing it. You know, was it helpless at times? Absolutely. Particularly when you're tied up hand and foot, and there's not much you can do. You know, it was interesting. Sometimes people will say, you know, why didn't you guys perhaps fight back immediately when they came through? You know, and my comment, of course, is it's pretty difficult to fight semi-automatic weapons with cross pens.
And most people don't understand the element of surprise.
Right. So so the negotiation happened, and the next thing we knew is that there were people running through the floor with bigger weapons than what the terrorists had. The SWAT team members, what happened is the terrorists got on one elevator and went down, and the police went on another elevator to come up. We didn't know the deal had been set. And think about this. When the police came in, they came in screaming obscenities, because they don't know who's on the floor. They don't know whether the terrorists had lied down with us.
Uh-huh.
And they want to freeze people because they're trained to react, and if someone jumped up, who knows if they would have shot one of the hostages.
Right.
And so, you know, their reaction was interesting as we watched it. And in the end, that's how it ended. It was negotiated settlement, thank God. And so then, of course, the question that you and I talked about quickly is, would you have that kind of cooperation today? It's questionable. And certainly as I talked to Patrick Mullaney, who's this wonderful individual, who was the FBI. After the FBI, he did security work, and he actually became a council member of Indian Wells, California. He served as mayor of Indian Wells. Just a wonderful, wonderful human being. And Patrick certainly confirmed how bad it was and how difficult it was, and he wasn't sure whether he was going to see us alive.
There is when the terrorists came down one elevator, the police went up the other.
Yep.
That's when the surrender took place.
That's correct. And when the terrorists got down to the bottom floor, they all Khalis's men were arrested, and they put Khalis in a car and drove him home. And of course, his home was guarded. Mm-hmm. And subsequently, they had phone taps on his wiretaps on the phone, and they heard him threatening people, and he was rearrested and never got out of jail again after that. But huge ironies, the Kareem irony, the Mustafa Akkad irony. Here's another irony for you that all the terrorists were convicted, sentenced from 35 to 85 years. Hamas Abdul Khalis was 56 when he came into the B'nai B'rith building. In 2003, he died in prison in North Carolina. A number of the terrorists were released. The youngest, Abdul Hamid, was 23, and the judge felt that he had been unduly influenced by Khalis as a teenager, so he was paroled early, but the police put him back in, and it lasted for about 7 years. And a defense attorney worked on it with a very creative way to finally get the D.C. Court of Appeals to uphold the parole. And the defense attorney who did that, her name was Greta Van Susteren.
Really?
Yes. And what's ironic about that is I know Greta. Her brother-in-law hired me at the Mortgage Bankers Association and utilized Greta at some functions where she moderated some sessions. And I don't think we both never connected it. I never knew until I did the research that she was involved as the attorney, and she probably never knew that I was one of the hostages.
So the youngest terrorist, is he still living, or?
Oh, sure.
Uh-huh.
The youngest terrorist was paroled. He got out of prison after about 2 or 3 years, and then this appeal took place through 1985 when it was finally upheld. Abdul Latif, as an example, I believe was released in 91 from prison. The one who broke my cheekbone, Abdul Adam, he was finally released in 2010. So he served 30 some odd years in prison. And a number of them are still in prison. They have not gotten out. The terrorist at the district building where the young reporter was killed and Marion Barry was shot will spend the rest of their lives in jail. They will never get out. And so, it was, the trial took place. It was a number of months, and they were all convicted and served sentences. And some still in prison, others had gotten out already. It's interesting. Another irony just shows you how the small world is. When I met Patrick Mullaney, the FBI expert, and he told me the story that one of his first assignments was in New York City, and he was the coach of a basketball league, one of these Catholic youth leagues, and he said his team played against this gangly teenager at the time in New York, and the gangly teenager was 13 years old, and his name was Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And here's Patrick and Jabbar, had been a disciple of Khalis. One other irony, and not so much an irony, but just shows you what the world's like, and also the impact Khalis had on people. He mentored a young man, a young black man in New York. His name was David Belfield, and he gave David Belfield his Islamic name, as he did Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Duad Suluddin, and he became radicalized after the killing of Khalis's family, as others did, but he became even more radicalized. Duad Suluddin, after the Islamic Revolution in '79, and remember this was '77, and then the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place in '79, and Ambassador Zahidi could never go home again, and as well as others, and so Ambassador Zahidi's press attaché, Aki Tabatabai, remained in Washington to work with the Free Iran and get the Shah put back on the throne, into power in Iran. Mm-hmm. And in 1980, he went to answer a doorbell. It was a postman came to the door. It actually wasn't a postman. It was someone there to assassinate him. And this person posing as a postman shot Tabatabai 3 times and killed him on his doorstep in Bethesda, Maryland. And the person who did that, who then escaped the United States through Montreal to Geneva, and now today lives in Iran. He's in his 60s. His name was David Belfield, Duad Suluddin, who was mentored by Hamas Abdul Khalis.
My. So many twists and turns that all come back and hook up somewhere, some way.
Yeah, and I didn't know this, for 30 some odd years, and it wasn't until I committed myself and really committed myself. The Washington D.C. area is a large town in many respects. It has small town qualities to it. So I was seeing. I was one of the younger executives, so I was seeing obituaries of colleagues and knew it was escaping. And then my wife and I and my brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws had gone to Israel for a trip, and actually ran into a colleague who was a hostage with me at the B'nai B'rith building, and we hadn't seen each other in 30 some odd years. And he lives in Israel, and we were able to reconnect. And I walked away from that experience saying, I think someone needs to tell this story.
Yes. There's been no other book written. Is that correct?
No one else has written a book about it. This is it. That's
amazing.
So I worked on the book for 2 years, and after 2 years, came up with Forgotten Hostages, and that's the book that's out now.
And if anyone wants it, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles.
It's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and a number of other sites as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, do yourself a favor. Forgotten Hostages by Paul Green. You know, Paul, I scrooched out on the edge of my chair when I was telling people to scrooch out on the edge of their chair, and I've been there ever since. I just none of us can even begin to imagine what your ordeal was like back then.
But the message, it was very difficult, George. But the message also, I've always had a very optimistic view of life, and my wife and children, and we had a second daughter, and Jessica's 30 now, and Emily's 38, and they laugh at me because of my positive optimism about life, and that was there, and there's always hope in even the worst situations that you could take out of it.
Yeah.
It was interesting. Soon afterwards, growing up in Miami, of course, there was a lot of interest with the Miami press and Miami papers, and a young reporter from the Miami Herald had interviewed me. His name was Robert Liss, and it was interesting. I didn't know it at the time, but he was writing his own book as he was dying of cancer. So didn't know that as he was interviewing me. But Robert asked me at the end of the interview, he says, "What's different after this?" And I said to him, Robert, I said, I've always enjoyed and marveled at the beautiful blue sky. And all I can tell you that after that event, that blue sky is more intense than it ever was before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you're facing a life and death situation afterwards. Do you have a different perspective on life?
Well, I think you enjoy it to the fullest that you can every day, and appreciate the little things, and it was interesting. I tried to live my life the last 55 years the best that I could, and it was interesting. The woman, the Burmese woman who was held by the Burmese government, for all those years, and was just in the United States, and said something really interesting. She said, "To be kind to people costs nothing."
How true.
And we just need to be kinder to each other.
Isn't
how true is that?
Mm.
And you learn a lot about yourself, which in that kind of situation, just as you probably did when you were serving in Vietnam,
yes.
And saw people. So each of us face different situations, and then you learn a lot about yourself and how you react, and people, you just don't know how you would react until you're in that particular situation.
Exactly.
And I think it's just important to keep hope, always keep hope in some fashion, even in the worst situation that you're facing.
There's always some light, no matter how dark it gets. There's
Absolutely.
Always some light somewhere.
Well, that's the story, George.
Wow. Paul, that's incredible. Ladies and gentlemen, go to ForgottenHostages.com. There's a lot of good information there, and you can punch that little button, go to Amazon, get the book. How many pages is it?
It's about 224 pages.
I've got the funny feeling I'm going to get it. I'll be on Amazon tonight. But I have a feeling that this is one of those kind of reads that once you start, it's hard to put it down.
Yeah, and that's the reaction I've gotten from people, that it's an easy read, and that people have been reading it in one sitting or two sittings and been able to get through it. And what's been fun about it also is when you write a book and you just don't know who's reading it and how you're impacting people. And it's nice. I get notes from people I've never met or interacted with, and get notes about how the stories move them, and they're glad I wrote it. And it's very rewarding to hear that.
I imagine so. Paul, I thank you for contacting me.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be on your show.
I thank you for being here, sir. My best to you, to your family, and everything you put your hands to.
Thank you, George.
I just pray that God will just keep on blessing you real good.
Thank you, and best to you and your wife, George.
Thank you, sir, and we'll stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And there you have it. Forgotten Hostages by Mr. Paul Green. What a tremendous story. It'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Although I heard it, although I was involved in the interview, I was on the edge of my chair again as I sat here and listened to its entirety. I hope that you enjoyed it. And do yourself a favor, as I said, go to Amazon.com and get the book. Forgotten Hostages. Took place March 9th, 1977 in Washington, D.C. I trust that you'll tell somebody about the show tonight. We started out squirrelier than a bed bug. But then we got very serious. And this is where we are right now. I hope that you tell a friend, a neighbor, someone to tune in and listen. Listen to that personal account. Not only that, remember, we are going to have more real life, thrilling, intense, true episodes of people that have faced crises, trauma, and even death itself. And it'll put you on the edge of your seat. So tell somebody. You heard tonight the man who was a hostage in Washington, D.C., March 9th, 1977. He wrote a book called Forgotten Hostages. Pass the word. I believe that everyone needs to hear something like this. I say it every Friday night. There's a chance we might come on the air Saturday or Sunday, just depends. We haven't yet, but that's why I tell you, there's always a chance. If something breaks around here, we'll be on it. Trust me, we will be on it. We will be in the newsmobile, and we will be off and on it. And we'll be live on the scene. Whatever goes down, whatever takes place, you can rest assured that Espinlab and the gang will be right there in the middle of it. But if we don't come back this weekend, you'll see us Monday night. I want you to tune in. Same time, same station. Ann P. Rich will be with us. 133rd life on planet Earth. That ought to be interesting. Tune in on Monday night, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, right here on the Spreaker Network. And don't forget, there's a whole lot of love coming to you from the Funny Farm. Email me, georgece@comcast.net. georgece@comcast.net. And rest assured you'll get an answer. Wherever you're at, whatever you're going through, remember, someone cares about you. If it's nighttime where you are, have a good night. If it's already tomorrow, then you have a great day. But regardless of what it is and where you're at, till Monday night, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the Spreaker Network, this is George Espinlab saying good night, and God bless you.